Hello and welcome to the Of Interest podcast. I'm Gareth Vaughan from interest.co.nz. Immigration is often a hot topic in New Zealand, and many of us, of course, are immigrants or the descendants of immigrants. The numbers have fluctuated dramatically over the years and almost ground to a halt when the border was closed at the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic in March 2020. But now the borders are open again, and people, once again, are able to move between New Zealand and other countries. Business lobby is crying out for workers, and an election approaches in 2023. Given all this, it seems timely to have a discussion about migration and the population more broadly. To do this, I'm joined by Productivity Commission Chairman Ganesh Nana. Hi Ganesh, and welcome to the Of Interest podcast. It's good to have you with us. Look, the Productivity Commission recently undertook an inquiry into New Zealand's long-term immigration settings. There were a range of recommendations that came out of this. The one that caught my eye was the call for a government policy statement setting a clear strategic direction for immigration policy. This seems like a good place for us to start because New Zealand has no clearly articulated population strategy. So why did you call for this government policy statement?
Well, I think the overwhelming impression we got when we were doing the inquiry was just how, I suppose, ad hoc, our immigration policy settings have been and how they've developed over the last couple of decades, and how disconnected they are from other public policy questions. And clearly the level of immigration influences our overall population, influences the requirement for infrastructure, whether it be transport networks or whether it be hospitals or schools, and whether it be energy requirements, early childhood, all of those sorts of things, those sort of infrastructure investments. There's a disconnect between our immigration policy settings and those other decisions, and indeed a disconnect between the workforce training efforts we do as a nation in terms of skill development and labour market policy. And it's that disconnect and how immigration immigration policy decisions have been taken without any regard for those other decisions that need to be made. And so the policy statement, or the recommendation for a government policy statement, was really to encourage government to bring all of those arms of government policy together in the one statement and actually see how they connect so that they are internally consistent with each other. And that's critical, and then also hopefully embed in a bit more of a longer term focus for immigration rather than the ad hoc adjustments that we get every few months or years.
Ad hoc seems to be a very good description to me when you think back over the last couple of decades, as you say. Obviously, the numbers really, really fluctuate dramatically, as I said in the introduction, in terms of the number of immigrants coming in. And obviously there's a lot of factors related to that. But why do you think this has been such an ad hoc area of public policy?
Well, I would think that it's not peculiar for public policy to have a relatively short-term time horizon. And I think that encourages that ad hocery and encourages, I suppose, the lobbying nature of the way we do public policy and the scramble to get at the front of the queue saying you're the most important sector in the country and require these sorts of skills. And the way we derive policy, it encourages that sort of behaviour and discourages the longer term perspectives that we need. Just why do we want immigration? What is the purpose of immigration? What are the overall policy, population settings that we think are appropriate given our investment plans in terms of public transport, in terms of regional development, in terms of developing health services, education services. So it's the that longer term context needs to be put in, and it is not encouraged by the lack of, we would say, the lack of this, I suppose, a policy statement that drives government to look to that long term.
So in terms of the government policy statement that you have called for, what sort of time frame should this have?
Well, ideally something like a 10-year horizon, if not longer. Now, undoubtedly, it would need to be, I suppose, revised every sort of 3-4 years, given the change in the landscape, because lots of things happen that we don't foresee. But I think that sense of direction, that track that we are, and whether the number is high or low, we're relatively agnostic with that, and that's a decision to be made. But we're on this track of immigration around this sort of range that businesses can expect to continue over the longer term, over the next few years. They can plan accordingly. Those local government, in terms of infrastructure requirements, local government will be aware that this is the track we're on. Communities will be making similar decisions, and dare I say, education and training will be aware of these decisions, and we can incorporate that into our workforce efforts in terms of how much skills and training we need to do in particular areas.
So in terms of this call for a government policy statement, what sort of response did you get from the government to this, and indeed from some of the opposition politicians?
Well, we haven't had the formal response from government yet, and we are expecting that before Christmas. So, and we await that with some eagerness. I suppose informally across many agencies and interest groups, we've had a fairly positive response to it, very much in the context of embedding in some certainty, some degree of certainty. We're never going to get 100% certainty, but some degree of certainty around immigration and also population growth, and some level of, I suppose, direction that then people can plan around.
Ultimately here, are we talking about a population policy? And by this I mean setting a specific target for how many people we want living in New Zealand at a specific time. And I mean, I guess we're a remote country with a small population, so we're in a position where we can shape things, how we'd like to a large degree. So I guess curious here as to should we push for a significantly bigger population, like say 10 million, to create a larger domestic market for the goods and services New Zealanders produce and recreate some of the buzz and culture found overseas? Or in a crowded world of, I think we're about 7.8 billion people now, would we be better off actually trying to retain a small population?
Well, in terms of our findings, we're relatively agnostic between those two options. It's a question on its own, and it's dearly a question I would love to go into in a lot more detail. But critically, when we ask those questions, we need to make sure that whichever of those routes we go down, we have consistent policies and consistent expectations in other areas. So if we go to the high route in terms of population, then that requires us to do some significant investment in supporting infrastructure, whether it be regional development, whether it be public transport, whether it be health and education and other social services, whether it be investment in sort of community expectations and community acceptance of that sort of level of population. We've got a lot of work to do to go down that route. So it's not just setting a target or setting a range, it's ensuring that we understand what the consequences of that are in terms of investment decisions, investment requirements, and indeed workforce requirements. Similarly, if we go down the low route, what are the investment decisions and workforce requirements that are consistent with that path and with that trajectory. And it's that consistency we've got to get. And so it's not just a population decision on its own. A population decision, as the Infrastructure Commission has pointed out quite clearly, it's the other decisions that go alongside whatever population route we might choose to take. I would add, though, and I do need to add, it's a caution in that we can't control our population totally, and there will be relatively, I suppose, larger swings than many would like because, and I don't suggest we would ever want to curtail this, but because New Zealanders have a habit of going abroad quite often, and that flow of New Zealanders, both offshore and onshore, is quite a significant part of our population growth over the short term anyway. But the longer term planning about, I would suggest a setting of clear expectations that we are having a population growth rate of X% over the next 10, 15 years. That goes into the GPS, and then alongside that then drives and sends signals about infrastructure planning, about how big Auckland needs to be, about how big other regions would grow, what are the workforce requirements to support that, those sorts of considerations.
It strikes me listening to you here, I mean, that this is a really big issue. And, look, we've had referendums in New Zealand in the past on things that are not probably nearly as important as this. I think of the flag referendum. I mean, okay, it was a big deal to some people, but I think this is a bigger issue in the, long run for New Zealand. As you say, the population, it impacts infrastructure needs, the labour market, the environment, just to name three things. Do you think a referendum on the sort of population size we'd like to have would be a reasonable thing to do?
I'm cautious. I mean, obviously, I'm incumbent to say, I have to say, the Productivity Commission doesn't have a view on referendums. So I would, so apologies if I sort of, I won't say avoid the question, but I think the critical thing is an understanding of the argument, an understanding of the information and the issues at play. So definitely a grown-up, mature conversation about immigration and population, we would definitely encourage and would say is critically needed in the New Zealand context, because we do have a lot of myths out there about immigration and population, and I suppose the reason why we're agnostic about the population size is because it's not the answer. It's not that in terms of our productivity and indeed our well-being journey, it's not the answer to lifting productivity by having more people in New Zealand, and it's not the answer by having less people. It's what goes alongside it. So we could, and we're in a relatively, some would argue, a relatively privileged position here in Aotearoa to have options in terms of what sort of trajectory we might have in terms of population, overall population growth. I'm not keen on setting a particular target, but at least some certainty around long-term growth would help with business planning, community planning, and policy planning. And I think that's the debate or the conversation we've got to have, rather than the I suppose my concern about a referendum on its own without the supporting information and matured conversation would be it would just encourage, I suppose, the extremes.
One argument that I often hear, and quite often from the commenters on our website, is that the population policy the New Zealand governments have pursued in recent years is effectively to import low-wage workers to suppress wage growth and prop up the housing market. I just wonder, does that, in your mind, does that stack up? And also, can immigration be used to actually lift the incomes of people in the host nation? And if so, how?
Well, those, the immigration being used as bringing in low wages and increasing house prices. It's one of those myths that we do need to blow out of the water, and our evidence and our inquiry provided that evidence. There's no overwhelming evidence that immigration has impacted wages negatively or impacted productivity negatively. We do clearly say that there are pockets of areas in the economy where, by sector and by region, where it has had those negative impacts. But overall, immigration has been positive for New Zealand. And as for house prices, our house prices have been growing, and we've had that problem in terms of housing for a lot longer than we had the latest surge in migration. So it's and that's part of in terms of your previous comment, in terms of your previous question about referendum. My concern is that migrants do tend to be used as scapegoats. It's the easy finger to point at in terms of looking for scapegoats for our problems. Problems with housing, problems with low wage economy, problems with productivity have been with us for a long time, and migration is not the problem. It's part of the solution. If we are, but again, I cannot reiterate too strongly, it's part of the solution as long as we do the other stuff with it. We've got to invest in our infrastructure. We've ignored that infrastructure. We've got to invest in what we, I suppose, what we called our absorptive capacity in our inquiry. The term absorptive capacity. If we want to go down the route of a higher population growth, we need to make sure that the absorptive capacity is there. So that's public transport, hospitals, schools, education, houses, all of those things. They go together, and it's that investment effort in the broader sense, infrastructure, social investment, all of those things need to go alongside our immigration policy.
Now, you are obviously the chairman of the Productivity Commission, so productivity is an issue close to your heart. Based on what you've said thus far, I'm not clear whether you think that there are specific immigration or population settings that would improve productivity. So what in particular can we do in the area of immigration, migration, that could improve productivity?
Yeah, again, and my apologies if it sounds like I'm avoiding the question, but again, it's not immigration on its own. If we're serious about lifting productivity, then we could choose the immigration route, but that requires us to commit to some significant infrastructure investment spend to build that absorptive capacity to ensure that those migrants as well as New Zealanders are productive when they come here, when they enter the workforce. That's the critical element that's missing. Yeah, as Productivity Commissioner, I am always ask that question, what's the one thing that we can do to lift productivity? It's not one thing, it's the wrong question. To lift productivity, we've got to do a range of things that are consistent with each other. And that's why we call for that GPS. We've got to do workforce development and training that is consistent with our immigration settings, that is consistent with our housing investment, with our schools, and all of those investments that lift absorptive capacity, that enable not just the migrants but New Zealanders as well in the workforce to be productive when they are in that workforce, when they are in jobs and active in the economy. That's the critical element, and alongside that, by definition, investments mean for the long term. So alongside that, those immigration settings for the long term, to enable businesses to plan, to give us that level of certainty, to plan their investments in new kit, in new machinery, in new equipment, new ways of doing things, investment in R&D, It's for the long term, alongside the investments in workforce skills and training that we need to do, alongside the immigrants that we might need to attract as well.
In terms of the immigrants we need to attract, I'm just curious to just ask briefly about, I guess, high-skilled immigrants versus perhaps low-skilled people, but, you know, maybe people with a really, really good work ethic and attitude. And I mean, we've probably all had Uber drivers who have PhDs or they're doctors, medical doctors or something in their home country and maybe can't work in that area in New Zealand. And then you meet people who perhaps have come here as a refugee and they work incredibly hard, and, you know, maybe they, you know, run a small business. Their children will, I can think of examples of people I've met, the children will get really good educations and become really, you know, high quality professionals when they're grown up. So that's, I guess, a longer term view as well. But I'm just, you know, in terms of the skill balance, what are the important things to consider?
Well, in terms of the skill balance, it should be the potential contribution to productivity and well-being, and that's the concern I suppose we have with the current settings, is around skills. Tends to be proxied by wages. So we are looking at with that wage threshold for the current immigration settings. It does concern us that it does, I suppose, encourage this idea that it's wages that deliver productivity, or high wages are delivering higher productivity, rather than acknowledging that there are a range of industries and sectors that, at least in the short term, need workers of appropriate skills. As long as, and I'm okay with those sorts of calls, as long as they are put alongside some longer term plans around workforce development. And so the classic example that I would use in terms of that high skill, low skill debate, or the high wage, low wage debate, is the need for aged care workers in our aged care industry. Now, many of those are arguably at the minimum wage or at the lower end of our wage spectrum, but at least in the short term, there isn't the workforce in New Zealand to fill those gaps. If you look at it from a well-being lens, if we have a set of values where we need to look after our aged population, we need those workers. But we cannot continue to rely on the migration avenue to continue to fill those gaps over the longer term. So we need to make sure that, that's another example, making sure that our immigration levers are consistent with our long-term workforce development programs and levers. That's where I'm on that high skill, low skill conversation. Again, I think it's more around the capabilities of the workers that we're after, and whether we can source them externally or internally. It's going to be a combination of those, definitely, if we're looking over the longer term.
To what extent should a debate on immigration and population include the natural resources influencing our living standards and quality of life? And I mean, the land use that we have with our pastoral activities and forestry, and obviously there's issues around there that we're wrestling with climate change at the moment, but that's a area where New Zealand earns a lot of, I guess, our export earnings, and then the natural beauty that attracts tourists and also helps produce our energy. We must surely have to factor all this in too.
And that just makes it a lot more complex. And again, that's one of those things that we need to ensure that our immigration levers are connected to. And so, yes, the impact of whatever population path we choose, what is the impact on our climate change or our climate emissions obligations? that should be factored into that GPS, those commitments that we have. And again, that would require certain investments in transformation, certain investments in the natural environment, and investments in changing the way we do things to ensure that we meet those obligations. So, yes, and again, that's an argument about whether a higher population has an impact on our climate obligations. It probably does, but it's not a one for one, and it's definitely not always in one direction. We might, we definitely need to have that conversation, and we definitely need to, again, I suppose, over the long term, if we've got a clear sense of direction of the trajectory of our population growth, then we can build that into our regional development programs, around our land use programs, and around our land use choices as well. I suppose in that conversation, one element that we did pick up that we haven't come across here, or haven't introduced here, I'll just bring in now, is the conversation with Māori in terms of, and not just land use, in terms of immigration. And we make the point in our inquiry that the Te Treaty was our first immigration document into Aotearoa. It literally enabled the colonisers to bring in their people. That's explicitly in the preamble of Te Treaty, and it's a little, well, more than a bit sad that in the 180 years since the signing of Te Treaty, we haven't gone back, we as a nation haven't gone back to Māori to ask them for their thoughts on immigration policy settings, and it's not embedded in the infrastructure of our immigration settings. So we're very keen in ensure, in terms of our recommendations, that gap is filled, and that Māori are part of those immigration conversations, because that's part of our obligations under the treaty. And definitely there are many Māori that I hear around the impact of population on our natural resources, on the whenua, on the water quality, and indeed on access to water that many Māori have been shut out of. So again, it just reinforces how immigration needs to be connected to all those other arms of government, rather than excluded or disconnected as it has been in the past.
The most recent figures from Statistics New Zealand actually showed that in the June year, we had our slowest population growth rate since the late 1980s. And the natural increase in the population of 24,100 was the lowest since World War II. The population increasing just 0.2% to 5.124 million in the June year. This is quite interesting. I mean, there were population declines in Auckland, Wellington, Nelson, the West Coast and Southland. It's in stark contrast to what was happening pre-COVID, when we were having annual population growth running around 2%. How do we assess this slowdown? Is this really related to COVID? Is there more going on here? And is this good news, bad news, or or a bit of both?
Well, again, let's not get too uptight about 1 year. Let's also, it was COVID. Let's not forget it's COVID. And like World War II, which was the last time we had this sort of growth, it was an exceptional period. What we probably do need to consider, though, is what is our population growth trajectory? What do we want to plan for? And put in levers to reach that trajectory. The fact that our natural increase, our birth rate is declining, is not news. Demographers have been telling us that for a long time, as have economists. So if we do have a population trajectory that is based around some, I won't say large, but some rate of growth that's above 0.5, say, then we are going to require migrants. So migration is always going to be part of our population story. Migration has always been part of the story of Aotearoa. So that's just reinforces just how important this question is. I'm not going to get too upset about population decline in 1 year. Again, I'm a person that looks over the longer term. The trends are, as many in the Western world and Western economies, yes, population growth is slowing, our birth rates are declining. That shouldn't scare us. It's a challenge. We do need to think about how do we plan accordingly. Regional development, regional growth, yes, again, it's a question for us to think about. There are lots of challenges and there are lots of opportunities with change. And I suppose reinforcing, the experience of the last couple of years, the next 10 or 20 years are going to look a lot different than the previous 10 or 20 years. That shouldn't, well, it might scare us, but that shouldn't go and get us into a sort of knee-jerk reaction of how do we get back to the past years. I mean, it's the sort of knee-jerk reaction that we need to get back to what we had before COVID. Well, let's think about how do we progress forward given the world has changed. And I know it's a cliche, but recognise this time it's right. The world is going to be a lot different. And if we continue to plan on the past, we will be disappointed. I think we've got an opportunity to set our own path and our own trajectory in terms of population and in terms of migration and population growth. Let's do that openly and explicitly rather than stumble into the rather large population growth we had pre-COVID.
You mentioned earlier that you're anticipating the formal response from the government to your inquiry into long-term immigration settings before Christmas. And I mentioned that next year obviously is an election year. Would you like and hope to see some more discussion and debate on these issues, indeed, heading into next year's election?
Absolutely. We've got to have a mature and informed debate, and hopefully the conversation and debate and argument doesn't decline into the extremes and doesn't decline into using migrants as the scapegoat for all of our problems, because they definitely are not. Migrants have contributed positively to Aotearoa New Zealand for a long time and will continue to do so. We just hope that we put it alongside the migrants coming in significant investment in our absorptive capacity to ensure that not only migrants but resident New Zealanders here already as well can lift the productivity and indeed the well-being that comes from living here.
Well, look, that's probably a good point to wrap up, Ganesh. It's a really interesting topic, and I'm sure it's one we're going to continue to hear a lot more about. That is Ganesh Nana, who is Chairman of the Productivity Commission, and I'm Gareth Vaughan from interest.co.nz with another episode of our Of Interest podcast.